Well, good morning, everyone, once again. So good to see everybody here, and glad you braved the snow. We're in the final chapter of Nehemiah, chapter 13. And up to this point, we've seen some really exciting moments in this book. And it all started off with just this one guy, and he had this longing, this idea to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem because they were in utter ruin. And so with God's help, he was able to go, and he was able to rebuild those walls at a record-setting pace. Now, this didn't go without troubles, without issues, without literal enemies raising up. But each one of those was dealt with in kind, and there was success. So that was the first half of the book. We saw this rebuilding of the walls. And then the book shifts. It shifts more towards the people, a rebuilding of the people. And so these people, they had the law read to them and explained, God's law explained to them. And so they went as far as to even write a covenant that proclaimed that they were going to follow God wholeheartedly, they were going to redirect their lives, they were going to shift their priorities to God. It was a great turning point for the nation of Israel. They were going to follow God. And everything, it seemed to be going so well. There was rededication. There was forgiveness. There was a great turning point. But as we enter chapter 13 here, it's not quite the case. Israel had once again relapsed into a sinful behavior. And so here in chapter 13, we see that there are three major problems that Nehemiah discovered. So the first one was that the house of God was forsaken. The second one was the people were violating the Sabbath. And finally, we see that they were marrying into false religions. The people of Israel, they had started to backslide. Even though they had promised and written a covenant, they would remain faithful. And this sudden turn of events, it seems so abrupt, because just in chapter 12, as we learned last week, there was celebration, there was dedication of the walls. There was turning to God. In chapter 9, the people rededicated themselves to Him. But now they're right back to sin. Just a few pages later, they're turning away and openly disobeying God. So let's take some time to look at each one of these issues here. So first, we have the house of God was forsaken, and that is in Nehemiah 13, verses 4 through 5. We'll look at that real quick. It says, "Now before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests." So immediately, right off the bat, that we notice this huge problem. Tobiah, he's back. If we remember, he was the enemy. He was the guy who tried to stop Nehemiah specifically from rebuilding the walls. Not a good guy. Not a good guy. And he definitely was no ally to Israel. Here he is, back in the story. And he's moved into the temple as if it was his very own palace. That is absolutely absurd. The temple, it was a holy place. And it was extremely important, yet here it is just being defiled. Can you imagine showing up to church one day to discover that our place of worship has been turned into a bar or maybe a brothel? It's the same type of thing that we're facing here. The temple was a holy place of worship. It was how the people of Israel worshiped and sacrificed to God. And having someone just move in and make it their living quarters, it's disgusting. It was wrong. And so this crime, it's further elevated because Tobiah, he was a known enemy. He wanted nothing more than to see Israel destroyed. It's a terrible, terrible situation that we're seeing. And it was facilitated by a priest nonetheless. I'd say that some mistakes were probably made. So to top it all off, let's look at Nehemiah verses 1 through 2. And it says, "On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. So right here, he's referring to Balaam, and he's another person found in the Old Testament. And maybe you've heard this story. See, if we remember, God had promised Abraham that he would make Israel a great nation. And with that came the promise of land, and we call that the Promised Land. So God, he's leading Israel each step of the way. And so there were many troubles that they faced, and some of them were caused by Israel themselves. But finally, they had this promised land. They had it in their sight. It was within grasp. And God started leading them to conquer and take the land. And so they fought many battles, and they were conquering the land and taking what was given to them by God. And there was this Moabite king named Balak, and he was fearful. He saw Israel conquering everything, slowly closing in, and he became afraid. So he hired Balaam to curse Israel. And I encourage you to read the story. It's found in Numbers 22, because it's really quite interesting. But to sum it up, Balaam, he tries to go and curse Israel, but God didn't allow it. And even we have this very interesting scene where Balaam's own donkey begins to speak to him, and it's quite crazy, but it's true. It's true. I encourage you to read it. And so God, he turns the whole situation around. He flips it all the way around. Balaam, he goes up to curse Israel, and what happens? He blesses them instead. Completely opposite. But because of all this, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they tried to harm Israel, and so they were forbidden from ever entering the temple. And honestly, they became a constant enemy to Israel. So let's bring it all back together. So it's referencing to Tobiah here. He was an Ammonite. He was strictly forbidden from even going in the temple, period. Yet here he is. He's not only entered it, he's moved in. He's made it his home. He's set up shop. Bad. That's bad. So this begs the question. All this is happening. Why didn't Nehemiah stop it? What's going on here? Well, let's look at verses 6 through 7. It says, "While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the court of the house of God." So back in chapter 2, we had Nehemiah. He first was asking leave for the king. He had to ask for permission because he worked for the king of Persia. And so the king obviously asked, well, how long are you going to be gone for? And so now we see that Nehemiah, he has returned back to Persia. And we're not entirely sure how long he was gone or when he left, but we know at the very least it would take about 55 days to travel from Jerusalem to Susa, which is where Nehemiah would have gone. And the 1,100-mile journey. And so that's just a one-way trip. So at the very minimum, he would have been gone for a decent amount of time, but probably longer. It's kind of disappointing, though, to see that even in a short amount of time, that Israel had already moved to sin so quickly and that the temple of God was defiled so quickly. But let's continue reading in verses 8 through 9, and then we'll see Nehemiah's response here. "And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave the orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God, with the grain offering and the frankincense." So Nehemiah, he was angry, and let's be honest, rightfully so. Upon returning to Jerusalem, he immediately begins to set things right. He throws all of Tobiah's junk out of the temple, and he proceeds to put it back into the proper order, the way it should be. Can you imagine being in Nehemiah's shoes right now? You've been working on Jerusalem, a lot of effort, a lot of blood, a lot of sweat to rebuilding it. Now you need to go back, you got to go back to your boss, the king of Persia. So you're gone for a little bit. The last time you were there, the walls were built, the people were getting right with God. Everything looked great. But now, you've come back and things are immediately taking a turn for the worse. Tobiah, that guy who tried to stop you, the enemy, he's moved in. No wonder Nehemiah was angry. Let's look at verses 10 through 11. I also found out that the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I asked them together and set them in their stations. So since Tobiah had moved in to the temple, the Levites and the singers, their needs weren't being taken care of. And they abandoned their duties in the temple so they could go work in their own fields. So a part of the tithe or the offering that was given to the Levites specifically so they could survive. And with that being neglected, it makes sense that they would return to their fields so they could get food. It's kind of important. So they had to find it elsewhere. And so, unfortunately, the Levites are gone, taking care of themselves now, so it had a side effect. There's no one at the temple to facilitate worship. And so it was like dominoes almost, and each one fell, causing another to fall. The people weren't taking care of the Levites, and at the same time Tobiah moves in. Because of that, the Levites, they need food, so they work in their own fields. Because they're not being fed, now the people are struggling because there's no worship. And now sin is setting in even deeper into their lives. It's really quite a mess that's going on. Thankfully, though, Nehemiah, he returned, and he immediately confronts each part of the situation. He starts to fix it. He kicked out Tobiah, and he started to restore the Levites into their different positions again. And he restored the storerooms and had tithes brought back in. And he goes a step further, though. He puts reliable people into these positions to keep an eye on things so something like this would never happen again. People in charge that he could trust to help keep this situation from happening ever again. Chapter 13, verse 14. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. Man, it would have been discouraging to return to Jerusalem and see it in this state. Everything that you'd worked so hard for starting to collapse. And the temple being such sad shape was a huge deal, and it needed to be fixed. And in this prayer, you can almost hear the desperation in Nehemiah's words. Don't let everything I've done for you be wiped away. So the next problem that we see is that the people, they were violating the Sabbath. Verse 15, it says, In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. So God, he commanded the people of Israel to keep the Sabbath day holy as a day of rest. And if we look at Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, it gives us specific details on that. It says, Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughter, your male servants, your female servants, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So Exodus, it's pretty clear what's expected of the people on the Sabbath day. However, in Nehemiah 13, we see that the people, they're openly violating this command. Let's look just a little bit further now, back in Nehemiah, verses 17 through 18. When I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. How quickly Israel had started to rebel, to turn back to these sinful ways. Just a few chapters ago, they'd made a covenant that they wouldn't turn back to sin, that they would continue to follow God. And now they're violating a basic commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy and free from work. And so Nehemiah, he rightfully points out that this is exactly what got Israel in trouble in the first place. They had rebelled against God, and they'd stopped following his commands. So quickly the people of Israel had started to revert to sin. But let's be honest with ourselves. How often do we do this in our own lives? God, this week I'm going to live for you. I'm going to pray more. I'm going to read my Bible more. I've said those things a lot. But, I start off strong. Yeah, I'm praying more. I'm reading my Bible more. And then it's gone, just a couple days in. And I'm back doing my own thing, wandering away, doing whatever. How many times have you started praying only to you get distracted partway through? This also happens to me a lot. I like to pray right before I go to bed, which apparently is a mistake, because I'm laying there, I'm praying to God, dear Lord, and then I'm sleeping. Happens so quick. Is God so insignificant to us that we can't even have a conversation with him without becoming distracted? It's so easy. It happens so easy. And here in Nehemiah, we see perfect examples of that. One chapter, the people, they're worshiping God, they're rededicating themselves. The next, we have the temples defiled, and we're just going to forget about the Sabbath day. We're going to disregard God's commands. And I get so frustrated with myself sometimes. Why don't I dedicate my time to the Lord like I do to my hobbies or to TV? I can spend countless hours working on the perfect bullet and gunpowder combination to get my rifle as accurate as possible. But I can't read my Bible. I can spend an entire afternoon sitting in front of TV just vegging. But I can't spend 15 minutes to God in uninterrupted prayer. The Christian life, it's a balance, right? But ultimately, we need to have God as our focus. Unlike Israel, we're under a different covenant, a new promise. But that doesn't exclude us from his commands. We don't need to strictly follow the law. But taking time out of our day for God is incredibly important. We don't need to have an entire day like Israel where we don't work. We don't have a strict Sabbath. But we do need to take time for God and his word. And if that means specifically setting an entire day or even just an hour aside for God, you need to do it. I drive a lot for work. And so that's a really good time to pray. Honestly, between driving from Glen Allen to Salina, that should give me plenty of time to talk to God. The key is actually do it. We can all find time in our lives for things, and we need to find that time for God. And what you spend your time in shows what's really important. We all say that we're really busy. We all say that things are going on. But you'll find time for what is important. God should be that important. So what did Nehemiah do? What did he do to fix this situation, to fix this disregard for the Sabbath? And if we look in verse 19, we see some of his solution. It says, "As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day." So Nehemiah closes those city doors, and when the foreign merchants show up, They see that Jerusalem, it's locked up tight. And eventually they took the hint, Jerusalem is closed on the Sabbath. And so by not allowing these merchants into the city on the Sabbath day, the people, they were less likely to be tempted and to violate that holy day. And we need to be careful in our own lives. See, just like Israel, they let sin creep in to the temple. And then they stopped honoring God by disrespecting the Sabbath, by disregarding it. And each of these things, it happened over time. I'm sure no one even noticed it until Nehemiah pointed it out and said, hey, what's going on here? No one likes correction or even constructive criticism, right? Let's be honest. But sometimes that's exactly what we need in our lives. Sometimes we need someone to yell at us and say, hey, what's going on here? Smack us around. Point out the flaws. But see, Nehemiah, he didn't just do that. He didn't just provide that correction. He said, what you're doing's wrong. He said that, but he showed solutions. He helped fix it. He helped get the people back on track. Verse 22, the last half of verse 22. It says, remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Nehemiah, he is constantly in prayer. And we see that after each one of these issues, he goes to God. And they're not long prayers, but they show exactly what was on Nehemiah's heart. He went humbly to God, and he asked the people that God spare the people and respond in love, even though they'd once again disregarded him. The next major issue that we see is that the people, they were marrying into false religions. Verses 23 through 25. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them, and cursed them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. So Nehemiah had yet again discovered another issue that Israel was failing in. And before we get too far into this, let me point out and be very specific. This is not a racial issue. There is absolutely nothing wrong with marrying another race or into another culture. This issue specifically is very different. Israel was specifically God's chosen people, and that means they were to worship and follow him exclusively. The other nations around Israel, they didn't worship God. They worshiped idols. They worshiped false gods. That is the real issue that we see here. Marrying into these other cultures was causing Israel to stray. And this passage points out that the children couldn't even speak Hebrew. This means that they weren't being taught about God or about following his laws. They were learning about false religions and fake gods. And this shows that the Israelites themselves were starting to stray. They were starting to stray from God. And honestly, how could they be focused on God and follow his commands when their own wives and children didn't even know God and were following a false deity? Let's continue on, and we'll look at verses 26 through 27. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all these great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? So this example here of King Solomon would have made a lot of sense to the people. He was a great king of Israel. But even he fell and strayed from God. And that Solomon, he was incredibly wise. But that didn't stop him from being tempted and turning to false gods. I mean, how could that be? He was a great king, and he was even the person responsible for building the first temple of Israel to God. But really, it's quite simple. See, Solomon, in all of his wisdom, he had married many women from the surrounding nations. And let's think about it for a second. Who is going to attack you if you're literally a part of their family? It seems wise to the world, but it came at a huge cost. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, it shows us what happened here. It says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughters of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, 'You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods.' Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." So let's start off with the obvious. I think marrying 700 women was probably a mistake. And honestly, it was a violation of what God wants for our relationships. And as we saw, King Solomon, even in all of his wisdom, he became corrupted. And he turned away from God because the women he married, they didn't follow or love the Lord, the only true God. And so this is the real problem that we're seeing here. And that's what Nehemiah is facing here in chapter 13. The people of Israel, they're being led astray by their own families, all because they didn't listen to the Lord, and they married those who followed false gods. Let's look at verse 28, back in Nehemiah 13, verse 28. "And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat, the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me." Can you believe it? Sanballat, another one of those enemies. He's popping back up. Him and Tobiah were buddies, and they both were responsible for trying to stop Israel from building the walls. He's not a good guy. He's a bad guy. And now we see that he is the father-in-law to the son of the high priest. No, not a good thing. Not a good thing. It shows how far this corruption had gone. Other people can have a much bigger influence in our lives than we can even realize sometimes. And whether that's positive or negative, people influence us. So this means that we need to be careful with what we allow into our lives, who we allow into our lives, who influences us. What good or bad behaviors do we allow into our lives? See, we need to analyze ourselves, and we need to ask these types of questions because they're very important. They can reveal things to us. 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 17 says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you." If we only hang out and associate with the world, that is what we're going to become. If we will adopt the lawless and disrespect of God that the world has. However, if we surround ourselves with believers and stay immersed in Scripture, our lives will respect and honor God, and our actions will reflect his glory. Nehemiah wanted to steer the people of Israel back to God. And sometimes this is exactly what we need in our own lives. Sometimes we need a course correction. We get off track and we don't even realize it. And I highly doubt that the people of Israel just overnight were like, yeah, you know what, let's turn away from God. That sounds like a good idea. In fact, let's be honest, they most likely didn't even realize what they'd done. Everything's great. And Nehemiah comes in, nope, it's not. They didn't even realize how far off track they'd gotten. And it took Nehemiah literally smacking heads to get some of those people to wake up, to turn their lives around. And it's quite shocking, considering just a few chapters ago, remember, they rededicated themselves to God. And the bad habits were changing into praise and honor to God. These types of sins, they don't just appear in our lives. Whoa. No, it happens gradual. It happens over time. Then before you know it, you're so off track, you don't even know where to turn. So this reminds me of a story that I once heard, and it was of a new pastor, and he started in this church. And right up on the stage was this huge statue of Mother Mary, this huge gaudy statue, and he hated it, despised it. And he said, let's just move that thing to the basement, let's get rid of it. The people, no, we can't do that. It's always been there, it's got to stay, this is important. This pastor said, no, I hate this thing. He came up with a plan. Over the course of several years, he moved it just a small amount. Just a small amount. And before you knew it, that statue was in the basement. And nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. It happened so gradually, so slowly. No one noticed this huge statue disappear. When things happen quickly, it's easy to notice it. That change or habit, when it happens quick, boom, there it is. It's like, that's different. When it's a slow, gradual change, it's easy to overlook or not even notice it. And that's exactly how sin creeps back into our lives. It slowly sneaks in. It worms its way into our thoughts, our actions, our hearts. It doesn't happen overnight, but over time. Just like that statue slowly moved to the basement. Sin can creep into our lives without even us noticing. Sometimes we need this wake-up call like Nehemiah gave to Israel for us to realize how far off track we've actually gotten. Let's look back in Nehemiah, verses 30 through 31. He says, "Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good." So the issues, they were taken care of, and Israel was on track to serve and honor God. Once again, we see that Nehemiah, he closes this section in prayer. And it's simple prayer, but it's effective. And I find it interesting how that each time Nehemiah saw one of these problems, what did he do? He closed it with prayer to God. And they weren't long or eloquent, short and simple. Here Nehemiah wants the Lord to remember him and all that he's done for Israel. It's not him boasting, look at what I've done. He did everything for God and to honor him. And surrounded by all these issues, I can imagine that it was heavy on Nehemiah's heart. Don't let everything that I've done be for nothing. Lord, don't let the people's commitments and rededications to you disappear so quickly. I can only imagine these were some of the things that he might have been thinking. But either way, Nehemiah, he asks the Lord to remember him and everything that he has done. And so as I studied this this chapter in Nehemiah, it was really disappointing to see Israel turn away so quickly. The past few chapters were just filled with rededication, with the law being read and explained, the people waking up. And it honestly looked like Israel had finally figured out that following God was best for their lives. However, they're only people, just like you and me. We so easily stray. We wander away from God, even though He's there for us no matter what. It's not God wandering from us. It's us from Him. We need to model our lives after Nehemiah, who stayed true to God, even when his fellow Israelites had let sin creep back into theirs. Let's pray. Dear Lord, help us to stay true to You, that we would guard our hearts and desires, and that we would stay loyal to You. It's so easy for us to be tempted by sin and to let it take over our lives, but help us to be strong so that we could honor You with our lives. Help us to be alert in our own lives so that we don't gradually slip away and follow those sinful desires. Lord, we want to remain faithful to You. Help us to be like Nehemiah, who was strong and faithful. When he got confronted with these problems, he corrected them. He didn't let his fellow Israelites go down the wrong path. Help us to be like him, Lord. Thank You for being just, merciful, and a loving God. And help us to honor You with our lives, Lord. In Your name I pray. Amen.